Hey guys, today we're talking about earth clays, also known as ceramic clays. So not surprisingly, earth clays come from the earth. They are used to make vessels like bowls, cups, and jars, and they've been used for that since ancient times. We're talking like 29,000 BCE. We're ridiculous. So fired earth clay, also known as ceramic, is very strong, and it can stand high temperatures and quick, drastic temperature changes, which is part of what makes it so valuable. So here you've got a selection of different types of ceramic, and there's a test going on about like heat resistance, particularly with like the glazes and stuff. So safety is sexy. Let's talk about safety. Raw clay is natural, but it might not be necessarily non-toxic because it contains iron and a bunch of other stuff. Processed earth clay might contain synthetics, but overall raw clay is safe to handle with your bare hands. Most glazes are non-toxic, most ones that you're going to kind of come across. And if you're going to be making a vessel that's going to be used for food, you definitely need to make sure that you're using a food-safe glaze. Not all glazes are food-safe, meaning they shouldn't come in contact with something you're going to eat. Some glazes are toxic, so definitely read the label on more advanced glazes. Some are toxic to touch, to inhalation if you're mixing them or spraying them, and to ingestion because they contain lead and cadmium. But yeah, and so heat protection is also one other thing. You don't need to dress up like this crazy moon man here. This is more so for doing glass blowing when you've got a very large piece that you're about to put into a kiln. It was just sculpted and blown and stuff. So you don't need a whole foil suit. But if you're doing a raku firing, like these two images here, we'll talk about raku firing. You definitely want to use some tongs, you want to have some gloves, like a leather top is good. Kevlar is actually a fabric, this is what they make bulletproof vests out of, but it's also very good in terms of heat protection. So Kevlar is great to have. You want to have at least some level of protection. So raku firing, you've got your ceramic, you've got your clay in the kiln, and it gets to a very high temperature, and then you grab it out of the kiln, you drop it into usually a trash can full of like dry leaves and newspaper and stuff, smack the lid on the trash can because everything goes up in flames, and then you get some really cool effects on your clay as a result of oxygen reduction and various chemical processes. So that involves taking really, really hot ceramics out of a kiln and throwing them into a trash can, so you definitely want to have your safety gear on for that. Natural fibers, again, is more something that you would need for glass blowing, because fake fibers like polyester will actually, if you drop hot glass or hot ceramic on polyester, it will actually melt and adhere to your skin in such a way that it needs to be surgically removed. Yeah, so natural fibers like cotton are always really good when you're dealing with any kind of heat or anything that might burn you or melt your friggin' clothes. So earth clays are not super useful for stop motion. They're really more for sculpture. The only thing for stop motion is you could use them for the clay buildup step of mold making. This picture, it looks like he's using plasticine, but earth clays are nice because then you can smooth it with just like a wet paintbrush a lot more easily than you can with plasticine. But that's the only real use for earth clay for stop motion. As I'll talk about in a second, I really don't advise you try using air dry clays that are earth-based. And so you might tell me, oh, but there are dolls that have porcelain doll heads, so why can't I use ceramic for my puppet head? But, I mean, dolls and marionettes don't really have to move the same way that puppets have to. They don't have to hold their own weight. Porcelain is very heavy. Well, any kind of clay is really very heavy. It's very fragile. And it's a lot of work to make a ceramic head. So you've got to sculpt it, you've got to fire it the first time, and then you might glaze it, and so maybe you have to fire it a second time, and to fire it you need access to a kiln. No. Just don't even bother at that point with porcelain. It's too heavy, it's too fragile. You don't want it for a stop-motion puppet. Especially nowadays when we have something like Sculpey, which is polymer or also known as Fimo clay. This stuff's great, and it comes in a variety of colors and strengths and all kinds of different qualities. And then you can actually fire this in your oven at home. And it's safe enough that it's not going to like taint your oven in any way. You can cook food in your oven afterward and not be worried that you're going to get some kind of disease or something. But yeah, Sculpey's really awesome. It's pretty cheap. So I definitely recommend using Sculpey for your puppet heads. I have been doing that. Sometimes you want to use aluminum foil to cut down on the weight of the head. One of the issues with making a puppet sometimes is that the head of the puppet is way too heavy for the body to be able to hold up. So you want to reduce that weight of that head as much as possible. So sometimes you might use some aluminum foil in that head. But the point is you're using Sculpey on the outside. And then once you, sculpt the Sculpey, you can just put that in your home oven and you've got a nice head. So I definitely recommend Sculpey instead of ceramic clays for a puppet head. But back to earth clays. So when I teach kids about earth clays, I say that they're a special kind of mud. And it is true, because they are found in riverbanks. They're found, amongst mud. They are mud, basically. But as opposed to mud, they have high plasticity. So that means they're very moldable. It kind of sticks together in a clump. If you've ever grabbed a bunch of mud and then closed your fist, the mud just kind of squishes out and falls on the ground. But clay is more, it's more like Play-Doh. It's kind of going to stick together in your hands, which is a nice thing. And it also, obviously, earth clays have high strength when they're baked in that special oven called a kiln. So yeah, and so again, yes, used for various different vessels. You'll definitely find a bunch of bakeware, that kind of stuff that you put in your oven for hours at a time, being made out of ceramic, because ceramic is just great with standing up to heat. Mugs and bowls and stuff you put in the microwave are often ceramic, because they're so good with heat. So earth clays have been used since ancient times. Like I said, this is an example of one of the earliest pieces of pottery ever found. Even the ancient Egyptians, they used to make these canopic jars where when they mummified a person, they would take out the organs of the dead body and put them in these canopic jars, which were just ceramic jars that have these that have animal heads on them. And then once they bury the person in their tomb, in their pyramid, in that burial room, they would put the canopic jars that have the organs in them. And I guess it was part of the idea that there's an afterlife, and so the body needs those organs to take with it into the afterlife. I'm not sure why you couldn't just leave the organs in the body, but whatever. They were smart people. They knew what they were doing, aside from the fact that they believed in what they did. But anyway, ancient Greek pottery was also a thing. There are various different periods of time within ancient Greek pottery. Like it's legit called black figure. That's a specific period of time in ancient Greek pottery. Black figure versus red figure. But that's sort of how they break down different periods in that. And then also, obviously, earth clay can be used for figure sculpture. Figure sculpture meaning human figures, but you could sculpt anything really that you wanted to do. And then you have all kinds of options for using glazes or paints or whatever you want, which is fun. But one of the things to keep in mind with figure sculpture or just working in clay in general with earth clay is that you need to hollow it out. You can't have a solid block of clay. If you put that in the kiln, it will explode and it will wreck anything else that's in the kiln with it. So you need to make sure that the walls of anything you make with earth clay are an inch, at the most maybe an inch, like half an inch to an inch thick. Yeah, you just have to hollow out. Or you can build something to be hollow to begin with. So you could have a newspaper form that you build up this little pyramid on, and then you can actually put the whole thing right in the kiln because the paper will burn up and go away, basically, and then you'll just be left with this hollow piece. So, yeah, good point to know. So major types of earth clay. We've got non-firing, which is air dry clay, which I will crap talk for a little bit because it just sucks. But mostly we'll be talking about firing clays. So you've got three major types: earthenware, stoneware, porcelain. There are multiple different subsets of these, and some people make their own clays where they add together different types of clays and different additives and things, and so you get, bizarre recipes or whatever. But these are the big main types of firing clays. So let's talk about non-firing clay first. Air dry clay, by non-firing, I mean it doesn't go in the kiln and harden in a kiln. I mean, I don't quite know what would happen if you did try to fire it, but the point is you sculpt something with it and then it air dries. And the problem with that is that it so often cracks horribly, and there's not really much you can do once it's cracked like this. I don't try to fill in the cracks with spackle or something. I don't know. But basically it has a high water content, and so as the water evaporates, the material itself can't really adapt fast enough. And so you get these giant cracks. So air dry clay is also really heavy, and it cracks, and I do not recommend using it for pretty much anything really. So don't use for your puppets, you're gonna get all the cracks, and definitely don't use for your set. But if you do use it, try to, between sculpting sessions, try to keep it wrapped up in a wet paper towel or wet towel, and then plastic on top to try to keep it from drying out before you want it to dry out. And if you do want it to dry out, once you're ready for it to dry out, you want to try to control that drying so that, you know, you're exposing little bits at a time, to kind of control and make sure that like small thin bits aren't drying out too fast and falling off, whereas big thick bits are, you know, still wet. So you want to try to control that drying as much as possible. But in general, don't use air dry earth clays. That's the other point. I'm talking about air dry earth clays. There are other types of air dry clays that might be okay. They might not crack. And many of those are available at AC Moore, Michaels, or whatever. But air dry earth clay, I'm talking about. Don't even bother with it. But we are talking about firing clays. Like I said, there's earthenware, stoneware, and porcelain. So firing means putting it into that kiln that gets super, super hot, and it basically solidifies and strengthens the clay to the point where it becomes officially called ceramic. So there is actually fire involved in some cases. So earthenware is the most common type of clay that's found, and it's one of the earliest clays that was ever used. It's highly plastic. So plastic in the context of art means moldable, squishable, sculpturable, that's not a word. Basically just moldable. That's what plastic means in the art realm. I know when you see the word plastic, you think of the hard plastic that pretty much surround, like everything around you right now is made of plastic. But no, plastic in the sense of clay means sculptable, moldable. So anyway, earthenware is highly plastic, so it's very easily worked, but it can be a little bit sticky. One of the most popular types of earthenware is terracotta, and the word terracotta literally means baked earth. Terra or tierra in many languages means earth. And so, yeah, earthenware, yeah. It seems kind of redundant, earthenware, earth clay, but, you know, whatever. So terracotta pots are something you're probably familiar with. Those are great for planting plants in because the terracotta material itself allows air and water to pass through the walls of the pot, and it promotes healthy plants by preventing the roots from rotting and prevents like disease from overwatering the plant. Another cool thing, you can get these little bears, these little terracotta bears, Bisqueware bears, that you can put into your brown sugar. And since Bisqueware in general, and especially terracotta, is very thirsty, it kind of sucks up moisture from all around it. That little bear will suck up any moisture that's in your brown sugar container and will keep that moisture from making your brown sugar clump. So if you can get one of these cute little bears, that'll just keep your brown sugar from clumping. It's a cute little thing. So yeah, earthenware is a relatively low firing temperature, and by that I mean 1700 to 2000 degrees Fahrenheit. That's a low temperature when it comes to ceramics. So, whoa. Okay, stoneware is next. I have a feeling stoneware might be a little bit stronger than earthenware, in the way that concrete is stronger than plaster, because, you know, it contains stones. Yeah, I don't know. So stoneware has varying levels of texture. Definitely has a texture to it. You've got different consistencies of particulates, basically, particulates. And those are called grog. So you can get different layers of grog, different levels of grog, different larger sizes of little stones or smaller sizes. But yeah, so yes, so stoneware is a little bit less, it's a little bit harder to work than earthenware. And its firing temperature is around 2100 to 2300 degrees Fahrenheit. So that's like a mid-range-ish firing temperature. And then next we have porcelain, which is also known as kaolin. Kaolin? I'm not totally sure how to pronounce that. Kaolin is something that you see in face masks a lot, like those clay face masks that you might get. And so porcelain, in my understanding, is a higher grade of clay, sort of like how hydrocal plaster is a finer grade of plaster. Just getting nerdy about materials there. So porcelain has a very fine grain, it's very smooth, it fires to a beautiful white, but it's very difficult to work with. It's just not as, it's just more difficult to work with than earthenware. So a lot of fine ceramics, a lot of fine china and stuff is made from porcelain. And the fun thing about porcelain is that it is the only type of clay, the only type of earth clay that is translucent, that light can actually pass through. So you can see, you've got like little lights and little tea lights and things that are lit from within, and they're made out of porcelain. So that's fun. I enjoy that. And so this is a relatively high fire at 3,200 degrees Fahrenheit is what I'm seeing on some sites. But yeah, so firing clays in general, some potters will mix their own clay. They'll add a whole bunch of different additives and things to make it more workable or stronger or grittier, or, you know, all these different properties. All of those types of clay go through the same stages, basically. And so to really dumb it down, the most basic version of the stages it goes through is clay, and then it goes into its first firing in the kiln. And then after its first firing, it becomes bisque or ceramic, like you see here. Yeah, when you buy clay, it's this big block like this. And then it gets fired for its first time, and it becomes bisque or ceramic. And then you can stop there, or you can put glaze on it, fire it a second time, and now you've got glazed ceramic. So that's the bare bones of like the process. If you want to get real involved, you've got these other terms here. This gets kind of involved, but we're going to go through it anyway. So we've got raw clay, like I said, in which case you've got the plastic, the moldable version, and you've got slip, which we'll talk about, which is this guy right here. Greenware is just dried out raw clay, various levels of dried out. And then Bisqueware, like we said back there. Yeah, so these are our three that we just talked about. So Bisqueware is after it's been fired once, and then Glazeware is when it's been fired twice, and it is glazed. So let's talk about raw clay first. In its plastic form, it is moldable. So when you buy it, it comes in this big block like this, and so it's able to be used for throwing on a potter's wheel, which is something that we'll talk about. That's always really fun if you ever get a chance to try it. It's really awesome. And so you can sculpt, you can do all kinds of different things with raw clay in its plastic form. And so now we'll talk real quick about working with clay in its plastic form. Between different sessions of sculpting raw clay, you want to keep it wrapped up. So wet paper towels, wet towels, and then plastic on top of that. Because if it dries out, you can't really work it anymore, basically. And so let's look at all the tools, the common tools that you might use for working with raw clay. So this is your basic tool set right here. You've got a needle tool, ribbon tools, sponge, wire cutter, shapers, and a wooden clay tool. So let's look at needle tool. Basically, that's pretty self-explanatory. It's very sharp, so you can make little holes with it. You can carve with it. You can do all kinds of stuff with a little needle tool. A ribbon tool. These two guys are ribbon tools. I'm not entirely sure if they're named that because the tool itself has like a ribbon of metal, or because it kind of pulls out a ribbon of clay as it's being used. I don't know. Either way, maybe both. Whatever. It's a ribbon tool. So here's a quick little video of me using a ribbon tool. This is a little acne tool, actually, but it works for, it makes some really nice, it takes some really nice little bits out of clay. It's basically a miniature ribbon tool, the way that it works. So yeah, this is a larger, this is your more standard ribbon tool for working with clay. So it basically, you know, it removes basically like a ribbon's worth. It kind of makes a ribbon. So you can get a nice little set of ribbon tools like this. You've got the little tiny ones. You've also got a little wire brush here, and one of your needle tools. And so you can get ribbon tools in all different shapes. And they are definitely good for, once you throw something on a potter's wheel, you can put it upside down and carve the bottom with a ribbon tool, and kind of get some nice little carvings in there. It pulls out, again, like these nice little ribbons. Next we've got sponge, which you obviously need water with. It would be dumb to try to have a dry sponge. So that's just for re-wetting the clay and helping to smooth the clay. A wire cutter might be kind of a strange thing if you've never experienced it. It's literally just a piece of wire suspended between two sticks. And this is how you cut clay. As you can see here, you can literally just pull the wire through and you get a nice slice. So that's convenient, especially when you've got a giant block like this. You can't really use a knife to try to get through it. Wire cutters work pretty well, which is great. Shapers are also good to have. You definitely use those when you're throwing on a wheel, mostly when you're throwing on a wheel, possibly scraping some clay off a surface, but mostly throwing on a wheel when you're trying to like smooth down the side of something. And then you've got your wooden clay tool, which doesn't have a fancy name or anything. It's just literally a little wooden knife. So optional tools, you got some optional tools. Also, a wire brush is this little guy right here. So you could use that to do like a hair texture. It obviously brushes some texture in. So you could use that for a bunch of different things. We'll talk about slip and score in a second. You can definitely use it for that. I have ordered dental tools from online before, which is, like I said in the other video, that's why Amazon seems to think I'm a dentist. But dental tools are really good for sculpting. Various knives. This is a palette knife. There's a palette knife there. Those are used often for like mixing paints and stuff, but they're also really useful in other art realms. So they're just like really blunt, kind of spatulas in a way. Here you've got various knives that you could use to cut and carve into hardened clay if you want to make it have like a lace texture or something. Some drill bit tools, yeah, these guys have little drill bits on them so you can drill into hardened clay. Pipe cleaner tool, I guess that would be helpful. I guess you could smooth, like if you cut a hole out of something, or I don't know. But yeah, there's a bunch of different things that you can use. And so optional, I love these silicone shaper things. I use them for all kinds of stuff. They might work pretty well for clay. You've got ball and dotting tools. So those could be good for putting dots of glaze onto something, or putting little divots, like little dimples into a piece of clay, as could these guys with the bigger balls on them. Toothbrush is also really helpful. You should definitely have one of those around. I'll talk about that in a second in terms of clay. So some of the bigger machinery that you might have, if you have a chance to get to it, is an extruder. If you've ever played with one of these guys as a kid, one of those little Play-Doh things where you put the Play-Doh in one end and you pull a lever of some kind and then it squirts out the other end, that is an extruder. So basically that property, you can use that for all kinds of different clay, and depending on which sort of end you put on it, you get different shapes coming out. So that's a nice way to mix clay. It's a nice way to get a very uniform long stick, or what's known as a coil of clay, or little spaghetti pieces, or whatever you want to do. That's called an extruder. You also have a slab roller, which is basically a printing press. It's a very heavy roller that rolls out a piece of clay into a slab. So a slab is basically like when you are making sugar cookies and you roll out the dough into a big thin thing, a slab. Slabs are really great. You can build from them. You can cut out of them like you can with cookies and cookie cutters. So slab rollers are nice to have around if you're doing a lot of ceramic work. But you can always, of course, use just use a rolling pin. So in terms of techniques for working with raw clay, we've got score and slip, which is a really important, essential thing to know when you're working with earth clays. So this is how you join two pieces together. You can't just stick them together and hope that they're going to stay, because they might stick together at first, and then you put them in the kiln, they'll fall apart. So what you have to do is you have to score. You have to make little knife cuts basically in both objects that need to be attached, and then use a little bit of slip, which is watered down clay. You're kind of using that as glue. Stick the two pieces together and then smooth them into each other. So here's an example of score and slip. You've got liquid clay here. This is slip. You can make slip yourself just by watering down clay, or you can buy it in containers like already ready to go. And by scoring, you've got this wire brush that we mentioned. So you're making this like texture here. You're kind of helping the two pieces to grab to each other basically. And a score and slip hack, you can actually just use a toothbrush that's been dipped in slip. So you can skip the whole scoring part and just do it all in one step. That's a pretty nice, convenient thing to do. So working raw clay, in terms of techniques, there are many different ways to build a vessel or a sculpture using raw clay. This applies to all different types of clay also, not just earth clays. So the pinch technique. I'm sure when you were a kid you went to an art camp or something where you made little pinch pots. Everybody has that experience, I feel like, and it's good. It's a good first experience to ceramic clay. But that is like a legit way to make a bowl or something. It might not be as uniform as one that you would throw on a potter's wheel, but it is fun and unique, and it has its own sort of charm to it. So it's possible to make all kinds of things just through the pinch method. this is basically a pinch bowl on its side that they've added like a tongue and stuff to. So the pinch technique is not just for kids. Anybody can use it, really. So next you've got the coil technique. So you're rolling out coils, like long, thin, sort of like when you're making soft pretzels, like a long, thin rope of clay, and then you build up coil by coil. And you can either leave the coils like that, or you can smooth them into each other as you go and make a vessel that way. Again, you have to score and slip between each of those coils so they actually like connect to each other. So slab, I talked about having a slab roller or using a rolling pin. You can actually make vessels with a slab by literally just kind of like folding it together like this, and then just make sure you close up that seam really well. So for sculpture in general, there's the additive and the subtractive methods. So additive, you're starting, in the case of this sculpture, probably started with like a ball of clay and then added clay on to build up the form. So obviously that's the additive technique. The subtractive technique is what, you know, Michelangelo and all these people were known for, taking a block of marble and carving something out of it. So you're removing material, you're subtracting material to make your form, and it's a heck of a lot tougher, definitely. I could never make a sculpture like this out of a block of marble. It's totally beyond me. I was a sculpture major, and I will never understand how the heck, like, they didn't have Dremels back then, like, what, I don't know. Anyway, and then the last type of hand building we can talk about is throwing. Of course I had to use this picture because of course everyone knows this movie, and of course everyone is making jokes about this movie all the time. But that's what they're doing. They're throwing clay right there. I actually haven't seen the movie. I should probably see it, I guess. Anyway, with throwing, you've got the clay on a rotating bat. It's called a bat. And you have to center it, and then you can slowly start bringing it up into a form, and it's the best way to get a very symmetrical vessel. Yeah, so it's really fun if you ever get a chance to try it. To master it, it definitely takes years, possibly even like a decade, to really truly master throwing. People who have mastered it can make a vessel in like 2 minutes, 3 minutes, something like that. But throwing is really fun. So, yeah. And you can get all kinds of different vessels. This is a pretty like straightforward kind of whatever it is, but you can get all kinds of different things from it. And so this is a throwing wheel. This is what you do to throw clay. I'm not entirely sure why it's called throwing, but so people used to use a kick wheel like this. So to make it spin, you actually have to kick down here, which to me is not a good idea because you're trying to like keep your hands really still to make some like very intricate movements with the clay here, and but you're trying to kick the wheel. I'm sure there's a way to do it, but nowadays we have these motorized wheels, and obviously it's just like a car. The more you press the pedal, the faster it goes. So you can really kind of like you know, as you're doing different moves, you need the clay to be revolving faster or slower. So yeah, so it's called a throwing wheel. These are some of the tools that you would use if you're throwing clay. So a fettling knife is just a clay tool. It's a very blunt knife that you're using for clay. The rib is like the shapers that I talked about. They're also known as ribs. A sponge, yeah, a wire cutting tool, wooden modeling knives, rubber shaper like I mentioned. Calipers help you to measure so that you're able to make a lid that fits onto a vessel. You can measure the diameter of the vessel and then take that measurement and make a lid that will correspond. Here's also a needle tool that we talked about, and then a slip bucket, which, yeah, if you do leave it out, it does gather a pretty awful stink, but I mean, how long are you leaving it out for? But whatever, yeah, a whole bucket full of slip. And so the basic steps for throwing clay, you've got your bat here, and then you've got your big ball of clay, and you really actually do throw it down to try to get it to stick as well as possible. It's very forceful. And you kind of spank it around and kind of move it around to try to get it centered. That's the biggest deal when you're throwing clay. You've got to get it centered, otherwise everything is going to be off. Your symmetry, it's just going to be horrible. One side of the vessel is going to have a really thick wall, and the other side is going to have a really thin wall. It's just going to fall apart. So yeah, spank it around, make sure you're centering it, And then one of the big steps is to cone up. So you're using your hands to make a cone shape upward with the clay. And then you actually do that backwards. You cone back down again. And it kind of works the clay, gets it warmed up, gets it moving, gets it moisturized, prepares the clay, kind of kneads it. It's an important step. It seems like it's why would you cone it up if you're just going to cone it back down again? But there is purpose to it. And then once you've coned down, you can slowly start to open the vessel. And you do that with your thumbs. Generally, you make like a dimple with your thumbs, and then you slowly kind of insert your thumbs more till you're opening up the wall, you're flattening out the bottom. And then you do your first pull, which is when you start to pull material up. So we'll see that in a video I have. You'll see like an actual ripple of clay kind of slowly move its way up, and that's how you gradually coax it up into a vessel. So you're continuing to bring the walls up, and then you can add all kinds of details. And then eventually, once you're done, you use that wire cutter real flush against the bat to cut off the piece that you've just made. And like I said, people who have really mastered this process can do all of this in like 3 minutes or so. They're like machines. It's crazy. So here's another one that gets a little bit more detailed. So yeah, pause the video and take a screenshot if you want to know a lot more details of how to do all this. But again, you've got like centering the clay, opening it up, pulling the walls, sponge up any water, relax and have fun, blah, blah, blah. Yeah, so here's some more pictures just to reiterate the steps in throwing. So you're centering. I would not recommend trying to throw a mass of clay that is this big. That's going to take a lot of muscle, and B, a lot of expertise that you probably don't have at this point. So stay medium sized when you first start out. So coning up, there's coning up, and then coning back down. You can use like the heel of your palm, and then opening. You're inserting your fingers into there to make a dimple, and then slowly deepen the dimple until you're making sort of a cup shape. You're pulling the wall. Here's what I'm talking about. You have this ripple coming up. So that's being caused by the fingers on the inside, and that's how you bring clay from the base up into the walls, because you've got all your mass down here and you want to bring up walls into the taller form. So repeat pulling the walls, and then you can add all kinds of different details while the clay is still on the bat, still spinning, or you can do those afterward. And then once the piece has started to dry, once it's in like the leather hard stage, which we'll talk about, you can put it upside down on the potter's wheel and trim the bottom, trim like a nice bottom with these with the ribbon tools here, like a nice rim and stuff on the bottom. You could put your initials down there or whatever you want. And then if you want to, you can always carve clay. You can do some really nice carving work once it's at this leather hard stage. It has to be leather hard, which we'll talk about. So it's like still got some moisture in it, but it's strong enough and solid enough to not deform when you're trying to carve it. So here's a video of somebody throwing. See if you can see all the steps that we just talked about. So one other way of working raw clay is not hand building, it's actually machine building. So nowadays you can 3D print clay, which is freaking awesome. So if you know anything about a 3D printer, it builds things up layer by layer. Yeah, so that's pretty much it. So you can get some really cool forms, and it's really cool to watch it print. I'm not quite sure how 3D printing does take a long time to print something though, because it's putting down very thin layers. So it might take, you know, hours to print something like this. But one thing about 3D printing is you're going to get a very distinct texture, pretty much no matter what you're 3D printing in. And so you can either leave that texture, or you could wait until the clay is dried out and do some sanding. You know, dip it in a really thick glaze, and you might be able to fill in some of that texture. So you have some choices if you're doing 3D printing. But yeah, it's pretty awesome that we can do that. So stages of firing clay, we're going back to raw clay. We talked about plastic, now we can talk about slip. So slip, like I said, is watered down clay, so you can make it yourself by watering down some clay in a little container, or you can actually buy it in a container like this. And you see it says cone 5 on here. We're going to talk about firing and cones and what that means. So slip is very important also, you know, for the score and slip method, but also just in general, you can do a lot of fun things with slip, like slip casting. So if you have a stone mold, which is a mold made out of plaster, usually plaster or ultracal, which is a type of plaster that's mixed with cement. So if you have a stone mold, you can pour slip into that stone mold. And the stone itself, the plaster, is very thirsty. It's going to suck up all the water in the slip and help the slip to solidify into clay again. And then you can take out this piece. So it's going in liquid and it's coming out solid. And then you can take that piece and fire it. And the idea with mold making is that you can make you can make multiples of the same exact object and fire them. So mold making is still a big deal, even though we've got things like 3D printing and stuff nowadays. And so the point I'm making over here is that you want to use a stone mold because it will suck up that extra moisture. You don't want to use a silicone or latex mold, which is not going to suck up any kind of moisture at all. It's just going to, your slip's just going to sit there. And so that was all talking about raw clay. We talked about working with plastic, and we talked about slip. So now we get into greenware. So these are all stages that happen before the first firing. So greenware is when you've shaped the clay and you're happy with it and it's starting to dry out. So you've got leather hard and you've got bone dry. So leather hard, you can do some carving, you can do a bunch of stuff. You can still wet it and get it back to a plastic state at this point. A lot of clay that might be gray, or it looks kind of gray at this state. If you touch it, it's cool to the touch. That means that it's containing a good deal of water. That's what leather hard kind of means. And so, yeah, so you can do a lot of fun carving on leather hard clay. You can, you know, cut things out to make sort of like a lace type texture, just like little divots and stuff. And then the last step before it gets fired is bone dry. And the thing about this is you can't really you can try to carve it, but it's really delicate at this stage. It very easily cracks and chips. So you have to be really careful when it's at the bone dry stage. This is a stage where if you touch the vessel, it's not going to feel cool. It's going to feel room temperature. Again, the cool that you feel sometimes means that there's water content still in the vessel. Bone dry, the water's completely gone. And a good thing to remember is that clay has to be completely dried out before you can fire it for the first time. If it's not completely dried out, it will explode in the kiln as the water expands. Not good. And again, it'll seriously damage anything else that's in that kiln. But yeah, so it has to be bone dry. So there are various ways that you can slowly get your clay to dry out. You can just set it out and let it do it itself. Sometimes you have cabinets that can help dry them out. If you've got really thin bits, you do want to try to help control how fast it's drying out, because you don't want these really little thin bits to dry out super fast and maybe crack and break off, while as the thicker bits are still wet. But yeah, so there is some decoration that you can do at this stage before the clay is actually fired yet. You can add liquid iron oxide, which is what's going on here, which basically just stains the clay. There are slips that you can use that are colored. You can paint those on. There are some underglazes that you can use. We'll talk about glazes in a second. Sometimes there's an underglaze and then an overglaze that goes over top. So with clay that has not yet been fired, you can use some underglazes. Like I said, you can carve and you can add a bunch of different textures. You could sand it. You could do all kinds of different textures and things. That's decoration options before the first firing. Yeah, so let's talk about firing. So yeah, so firing happens in a kiln of some kind, which you can buy or you can make your own. It's pretty awesome to see pictures of the clay. It's literally red hot as it's in the kiln because, like I said, some of those firing temperatures are like 2,700 degrees or whatever. It's nuts. So clay used to be fired in firing pits by various different cultures. So they literally dug a pit in the ground and put their clay in there with bits of wood, sawdust. They lit the whole thing on fire. The process takes an hour. Or more than many hours is what I mean, not just an hour. But there are a lot of variables in the process. Certain parts of the clay might get oxygen, certain other parts might not. The fire is hotter in some areas and not as hot in other areas. There are a lot of variables, so the pottery would come out always different. Every piece looks different even. Different looking, different in strength. There's just a lot of variables, and it's not necessarily even heat like you might have nowadays in like official kilns that you might buy. So there's another, you can still fire in the ground. Some people still like to fire things in the ground, and that's totally still an option. But nowadays, most people buy a kiln like this, these electric kilns. They can be front loading or top loading. So different clays have to be fired at different temperatures. So how does one measure that the kiln has reached the right temperature? People used to want to use mercury thermometers, but those explode at 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit, so that's not really helpful. Oh yeah, you can also build your own kilns like this happy dude. He looks like he does ceramic art. That's mean. There's also differences sometimes in how the ceramic comes out, depending if the kiln is electric or gas powered, which is an interesting thing to consider. And so what I was talking about, how do you know that the kiln has reached the right temperature? This is even before we had digital thermometer type things in kilns. So they used to know this by using pyrometric cones, also known as witness cones. Pyrometric stands for fire measure. And so you've got these different cones that correspond to different firing temperatures. And so at least the original idea was that they would sit inside the kiln. So you could set up a whole row of them there. And as the kiln reaches certain temperatures, certain cones will start to droop. And you can look through, there's little peepholes often in the kilns that you can kind of look through and see if those cones have started to bend. So that's one of the old school ways of seeing if the kiln has reached the temperature it needed to get to yet. The other option with cones is that it's set up such that as the cone bends, it trips a mechanism inside the kiln, and that causes, I guess, the kiln to kind of stay at the temperature that it's at because it's reached the right one. So that's also an option, having a little trip mechanism in there. Nowadays we have automatic digital controllers for temperature, but a lot of people still use cones because they just prefer to use cones. And also we still use the terminology of cones, even if people are using digital controllers for temperature in their kilns. A little bit of science here. Cone means more than just temperature. It means heat work. So a measure of temperature over time. The cone tells when a piece of clay has absorbed the necessary amount of energy to change forms, so to change from clay into ceramic. And the higher the cone's number, the higher the temperature it responds to. So here's a chart that you definitely don't need, but it's extra information. So a low fire cone would be down here. So these 022, 022, which you might as well think of as -22, that's a low fire. And again, low fire is 1,094 degrees, which is not very low fire to me, but to ceramic it is. And so a high fire, you've got a cone number 15, and that's final temp is 2615 in Fahrenheit. So yeah, stuff that you don't really need to know unless you get into firing yourself. So we're talking about Bisqueware, also known as ceramic, which is clay that's been through its first firing. So you can either stop at that point with a ceramic piece, or you can add glaze to it and then do a second firing which makes it glazed ceramic. And then in some cases you do a third firing, but that's kind of ridiculous. So, no, I'm sure some people are really, you know, if you're really advanced, you might get into something like that. But so, Bisqueware ceramic. One of the cool, fun things you can do is when you open the kiln and the Bisqueware is still hot, you can take a feather and just press it against the side of a piece, and it'll leave this burned, like, really fun texture. You can also do the same thing with horsehair. So you get just like these really cool effects there. If you put these things on before the firing and then fired it, these objects would just burn up completely. I don't think they'd leave any kind of mark like this. So if you've ever been to one of those paint your own ceramic shops, where you pick out a piece of ceramic and then you paint it basically with glazes, and then you give it back to them, they fire it and then get it back to you, and it's nice and glossy and shiny and fun. That is, you know, that piece that you're picking out, that's Bisqueware, that's ceramic, and you're putting glaze on it, underglaze, and then they do an overglaze, a clear overglaze on top of it, kiln fire it, and then get it back to you. So these pieces that you're picking out, this is Bisqueware, this is ceramic, this has been through its first firing, and then you decorate it basically, and it goes through its second firing. One of these shops, that was my first job actually, was working at one of these shops, and so glazes are basically liquid glass. They seal the clay. They also obviously add visual appeal to it. They make them waterproof so that they're not sucking up water as much. Yeah, glazes are pretty fun. So you can get pretty solid color ones, or you can get all these different texturized ones that give you really cool effects. And so often you can buy glazes in this form. Amico is a pretty common brand. If you're making a ceramic piece that's going to come in contact with food, make sure that the glaze that you get is food safe. And so one of the things you might notice with glaze is that, so this is freckled brown, I think you can see. The thing with glazes is they look like a different color when you put them on. They look totally different than how they come out. So this is supposed to be, right here, this is supposed to be a freckled brown, but it obviously looks like a very matte, chalky gray. So that's something to look out for. As you can see here, yeah, definitely glazes will go on differently and then come out being all glossy and brightly colored and stuff. So these are pictures of the same vessels going into the second glaze firing and coming out of that glaze firing. And so with glazes in general, you've got an underglaze. Sometimes you do an underglaze and then you do a clear overglaze on top of that. That's often what's done, especially at those ceramic shops. And so you can dip directly into glaze, like an underglaze, or you can paint it on. There are lots of options there. So yeah, at the ceramic shops, you're painting on an underglaze. So it kind of looks like this. All the colors look like a very chalky pastel version of what they're going to be once they get fired. So this is what it looks like, basically, to paint your little design on your plate or whatever. And then here is the overglaze that the person who owns the shop will dip the entire thing in. So the overglaze is just like a clear coating that goes on top of the underglaze. So here you see some samples of the different types of glazes, again to help people understand that they go on differently than they come out of the glaze firing. Underglazes have a very particular look to them. They almost look like watercolor, really. They're not very opaque generally, and so you can see a lot of brush strokes and things in them. That's an underglaze, and then you've got the clear overglaze on top. You can do some fun effects with underglazes or overglazes. This is like a bubble effect that you can do. I think you just basically get a cup of glaze, and I think you can just water it down and then put a straw in there and kind of blow bubbles onto the plate, and it leaves that kind of texture, which is fun. You can also do things like applying underglaze or overglaze with an airbrush, so you get like a nice gradient going on there. You can do all kinds of different effects. And then the overglaze, like I said, is that clear glaze that goes on top of the underglaze. You can, however, skip the underglaze completely and just go with a really cool special effect kind of overglaze, like you see here. So again, the overglazes, even more so, look different than how they come out. So here on the right, it went on like a solid matte gray, matte chalky gray, and it came out like a crackled jade green, which is pretty fun. And over here, yeah, you've got two shades of blue that come out looking like, I don't even know how to describe that. The thing that I've learned with overglazes is that the messier you are with them, the better. So if you've got drips and drops and spots and all kinds of stuff, you're going to end up with like a really cool effect. That's just what I've learned. There's a bunch of different special effect overglazes. You've got ones that are meant to look like a crackle, that's like a crackle glaze. So it almost looks like the ceramic itself is cracked, but no, it's just the glaze, and it's totally safe, it's totally fine. It's just a special effect. This one I found online, this is involving silicon carbide, is making this really crazy texture on here, which is cool. So a lot of potters will get into making their own glazes. It gets into a bit of chemistry, really, just using different chemicals to try to get different reactions, basically. Different chemical reactions, really. And you've got some glazes that have bursts in them, so they have like these little beads or whatever that go on the surface, and in the kiln they kind of burst and make this almost like feathery kind of texture, or these like drippy kind of effects. It's cool stuff. You can apply overglazes just by dripping them and get some pretty cool textures and reactions and stuff. So you've got some drip going on over here, and then this bowl looks like it was like an underglaze, like a fiery underglaze, and then they dripped this like special effect overglaze in at the corners, and so you got this kind of like effect here. It's pretty cool. Again, dripping can be really nice. This is drip layered, so there's like different colors are dripped on one by one, and so you've got this almost like this really cool, I can't even describe any of these. Like, I really don't have the words. They're just so cool. And then sometimes with ceramics, you can like dip half of it in one glaze and then dip the other half in another glaze, and you get this nice like kind of transition here between the two. Now let's talk about raku firing, which is super, super cool. So you use generally certain clays that are meant for raku firing, and you get them to a certain temperature in the kiln, and then you open the kiln, you take the piece out, you throw it in a metal trash can, plastic would melt, throw it in a metal trash can, throw in a bunch of newspaper, dry leaves, a whole bunch of stuff. It's to the point where the whole thing catches on fire. You smack the lid on the trash can, and often what you're doing is you're letting the fire choke itself out, basically. The fire will eat up all of the oxygen that's in the container, and so you get some really cool textures and reactions on the ceramic from oxygen deprivation, basically. And there are other things, you know, it's a chemical process, and you can use different types of glazes that react in different ways. So raku firing is just really awesome. So here's a video of that process real quick. And raku glazes are so gorgeous. So they're specifically for raku, and you get these crazy gorgeous finishes with raku glazes. I'm such a sucker for this stuff. Like, oh, so gorgeous. And so all of these colors and these textures and things are created by oxygen deprivation or just various different chemical changes and things going on in there. Here's another example of dripping on a glaze. So that's really cool. So they've left some of the ceramic exposed, so you get this really cool kind of juxtaposition. I hate that I use the word juxtaposition. I sound like an art teacher. But yeah, so that's the end of this really long video about ceramics and earth clay. Definitely check out this guy, Ronit Baranga. I friggin' love his work. It's so creepy and it's so cool. So definitely check out his stuff. That is the end of me talking about this stuff. Earth clays. I never know how to end these things. Yay. Okay, bye.